I'll move. Great. Hello, everyone. We're excited to discuss women's entrepreneurship for this panel. I'm delighted to facilitate a discussion between some amazing speakers. I'm Shamarukh Mohiuddin, and I'm a principal associate at Nathan Associates, which is a global consulting firm that works on development issues. And I've worked on women's entrepreneurship in a number of different economies and geographies, including in Latin America and Asia. And also had the opportunity to work with UPS on the panel as well, Maria Luisa, on some research around small business and entrepreneurship in 15 countries. And just a little tidbit as well about myself is I used to be at the Chamber before, so I'm a Chamber alum, so really excited to be back for this event and see a lot of familiar faces. So our panel today will be discussing partnerships in particular and how the public and private sectors can work together to facilitate good partnerships that support women along the value chain and also support women in their startups as well. And we know that despite the recent surge in women-led startups, there are still a lot of obstacles that women face in building their businesses, including access to capital, access to training, networks and mentors, as well as access to markets. We heard earlier some of the work that the State Department is doing on connecting women to networks, which is super important. On top of this, women are also burdened with care duties. We had a session earlier on the care economy and how women are kind of working with fewer hours during the day to work on their businesses. And so women need the additional help that the private sector can provide. At the same time, women entrepreneurs contribute a significant GDP to every economy that they're in, and it's about a $3 trillion contribution to the US economy, and also especially important in developing economies where they're responsible for creating a lot of jobs, and then those women then in turn investing in their own communities. But the pandemic has had a significant impact on women entrepreneurs across economies, both in developed and developing economies. So we'll be talking about the impact of the pandemic as well. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel. I think everyone has the bios, but to my left is Maria Luisa Boyce. She's the director for UPS Global Affairs, Public Affairs, and brings over 20 years of experience and leadership to the area of international trade, entrepreneurship, customs issues, and trade facilitation. In her current role, she also represents the UPS Women Exporter Program, which she'll talk about. Then to her left is Linnea Oduro. She's the CEO and co-founder of Dine Diaspora, which is a company, as well as a nonprofit called Black Women in Food. And her mission is to create a more equitable food system through initiatives that center on the African diaspora. And she's originally from Ghana. And to her left, we have Linnea Gavrilis, who's a partner at EY, and she focuses on government and the public sector, and especially on the Department of State's account on military members and families. And before joining EY, she was working at the American Chief Foreign Service Association as their Chief Strategy Officer. So everyone brings a very unique perspective to this issue of entrepreneurship. So I'll start by asking a general question to all of you, just to learn a bit more about your focus on entrepreneurship, how your organization is working on this issue, and also the importance of supporting women's entrepreneurship. So maybe I'll start with you, Maria Luisa.
Thank you so much, Shamarukh, and it's such a pleasure to be here, and I love this topic. From UPS and the UPS Foundation, for us, investing in women entrepreneurship was really an easy decision to make because it's a good business decision in terms of investment, and it also is close to our commitment to the community and growth. And so we decided in 2018 to launch our Women Exporter Program to enable women entrepreneurs around the world to enter international trade, to learn about it. And we decided to do it in a three-pronged approach. We're doing through capacity building, training and knowledge and expertise, and trying to speak small business too, because sometimes I'm a trade nerd and a customs nerd, so you can get lost in the technical terms. So doing that capacity building in a way that will be useful, access to market, because you can be trained, but if you don't sell your product, it's not useful. So how do we empower them and connect them to sell their products? And last but not least, also important, what policy recommendations can we give to governments around the globe to support women entrepreneurship? So that's how we started. We have trained over 107,000 women entrepreneurs so far. Very excited. So look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and more excited to contribute to this conversation about women in the food industry particularly. My organization, Dine, Diaspora, our initiative is Black Women in Food. And we also work with women in three ways. Three's the charm here. The first is recognition. So across the food industry and across the United States and around the world, racism and sexism are entrenched in the food industry. And so we believe that recognition of women's contributions, particularly Black women's contributions to the food industry, is central. And so we have an awards program that actually honors women across the food system, from farmers to food waste professionals to activists. The second approach that we have is to access to capital. So we provide capital, well, knowing that Black women have the least amount of access to capital, starting businesses well under the startup capital than other races tend to have. And so we provide access to capital through grant programs where they're able to infuse it into their businesses, such as their restaurants, and growing those in those areas. And then the third one is resources and community. So we all know that without your networks, it's very difficult to even grow with the capital that you need. So we host events and opportunities for these women to connect not just with each other, but with investors, with people that are feeding into the food ecosystem that could really help them grow their businesses. So I'm really excited to join this panel and contribute about what we're doing in this area to support entrepreneurs.
Great. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I'm here from Ernst & Young, EY, and I wanted to focus on our entrepreneurship program. So we have three I'd like to highlight today, and we have distilled it really down to the two concepts of networking and mentorship. So the first program is our Entrepreneur of the Year Award, which some of you may have heard of. It takes place in 60 countries. We're growing all the time. And this is where people either self-nominate or are nominated to participate in an entrepreneurship award. And so what we do during that year is we help these companies with business plans, with strategies, with access to capital. We mentor them through the growth of their company, and we really try and help get them as strong as possible. And then during that year, there is a voting that happens sort of towards the end of the year, and there's a big program that we do in Monaco at the end of the year where we award an Entrepreneur of the Year. So that is, again, as I said, in 60 countries, and it's about 800 people that participate a year. We start at about 800, so it's pretty exciting. And that is for men and women. The next one is, we call it Winning Women. And so it's a program where it's 48 countries. We have about 600 people so far this year. But what we do is similar, right? The companies can either apply for the program, or they can be nominated. And those applications are open now, so anyone here who's interested. And those women are nominated, and again, same concept of mentorship. What we do for this one also is we really focus on the networks, right? And putting women together across these different countries. We try to make it like to like, right? Product company to product company, consulting to consulting, medical professionals to medical professionals. We try to organize it a bit. But that program goes on for a year. And there's no winner in that. It's just a cohort of people that we mentor for the year. And then the third program I wanted to highlight is one we call EAN, so Entrepreneurial Access Network. And that's one that we focus on. We focus on traditionally underserved communities. So it tends to be, women, men and women of color, but just those traditional communities that haven't really had sort of an even playing field to date. And so again, people can self-apply for that or have someone advocate for them. Those applications are also open right now. And what we do is we really, on that one, we go out really proactively with more of the marketing and more of the information to make sure that people who wouldn't traditionally think of EY as a mentor or a partner understand the purpose of this mentorship program that we have, this entrepreneurship program that we have, and make sure that they understand it's there and it's available. So with that, I will stop talking, but those are the three big ones for us. Thank you.
Great, all are great programs, and I think that the network effect is such an important point, so thanks for mentioning that. And one of the things I hear a lot when I hear about women's entrepreneurship is the access to credit issue as well. It's probably ranked as one of the top challenges, and Nina, you touched on your work in kind of helping in that area. So if you could talk a little bit about, in your experience, how have you seen this issue affect women, and if you're doing anything to support access to credit. And especially after the pandemic, this has become even more important. And also, what are some of the barriers that you're seeing that are difficult to overcome and might need like bigger intervention from government, et cetera?
So I guess I'll start. I think one of the biggest areas you mentioned is the access to credit that Black women particularly face. Here in the United States, we see it a lot in the food industry. And some of the barriers that we're seeing is that Black women are not even often seeking out banks because of the entrenched racism that has already existed in the country. And when they do, they're getting denied. And so that already exists and shapes people's actually behavior, that they're not even seeking out banks initially to start their businesses. So that's number one. So Black women tend to go to family, friends, to their communities for the initial startup funds that they use for their businesses. Oftentimes that makes it hard to grow if there isn't other investment coming in as compared to other races and their counterparts that are at the same level. What we tend to do is educate the women on those opportunities, bring in professionals from the banks, bring in professionals that are seeking to actually work with them in the areas that they're working in and see the opportunity of how they can grow by giving them capital in the food businesses so that they can thrive. Of course, I mentioned that access to capital that we provide is through grants, and those grants are funded particularly for the women to grow their businesses, and we've done them particularly in the restaurant industry, as you mentioned. And in the pandemic is when we saw, if anyone experienced the pandemic, restaurants were not operating pretty much. Many restaurants tend to pivot to actually creating products so that they can get something out to people. And so out of the pandemic, we created a grant with our partner Eat Okra, which is a food delivery, a Black-owned food delivery app, and really supported those businesses to really coming out of the pandemic to find ways that they could infuse capital that they desperately needed for essential items, essential things. It could be equipment, it could be resources that they need outside of that to really create a sustainable business because of the challenges that came out of the pandemic, but also overall in a system that tends to create challenges for them that they're trying to overcome in their businesses.
If I may complement that, because we were talking about this also when we were preparing, from UPS and UPS Foundation, access to finance was one of the top topics that came up as a challenge for women entrepreneurs. We did a lot of surveys, and so we have learned one thing: we cannot do this alone. It has to be a community approach. It does take a village. And so what we have done is we have focused on two areas. One, which I think is very important, is the training of access to finance, and we have done that through our partnership that we have with the International Trade Center She Trades Initiative, where we actually train the women entrepreneurs about bookkeeping and cash flow and investment and how to apply for a loan, and give them and teach them that there are money to be applied for. I think that's very important to the point that you were making. And so that was one element that was very important. To give you an example, the difference that the training did in Vietnam, where we have one of our programs, after training 150 women entrepreneurs that we trained in the foundation and bringing the community, the government, the banks, and having good applications, the women were able to access $2.4 million in loans and investment. That's a big, I know it sounds like maybe a small number, it's a big number in my world, but for these micro women entrepreneurs, it's a change of life, it's a change in the community. And so we are making certain to align that training. The second thing that we did through our foundation also provides funding to microfinance institutions. And microfinance is an economic engine around the world. And so through that, we have been able to provide millions of dollars of access to, through Opportunity International, Acción International, which what we did, and this is very important, is that we were more intentional about it. So we told the foundation, our partners, to focus on women entrepreneurship and provide that access to finance, and that is making a difference. I think intentionality and working together, makes a big difference.
Absolutely, and providing finance, but also the wraparound services, right? Like
Yes.
trainings, et cetera, are so
And how to
important.
apply.
Linnea, did you want to add anything to that point?
I do. I love what the Assistant Secretary was saying earlier in the story that he told about Morocco. And there was a woman who said, you know, I can't find an office, right? So I can't grow my business. And one of the things we found in the programs that we're running, particularly with the Women's Entrepreneurship Program, I'll say, is that, wow, you know, you get people together and we're going to link arms and help each other, right? And it's really inspiring to see that happen. So our entrepreneurial network, so once you go through one of these programs, you're part of the alumni network. It's, you know, 10,000 people now. And people will reach out and look for each other or look for ways to help. And it's really great. And I think something about, you know, UPS or an EY that's a global company, you know, we work in a number of different languages in all these different countries, but we can also help with things like establishing your business. What are the local tax laws? How do you set up a business in a local country? And those kinds of things are really, really helpful too, because often people have a great idea, but the actual execution, they just need a little bit of an assist, and then, man, you watch them take off, right?
Absolutely, great points. Speaking of your global and local work, how do you see this issue of entrepreneurship affect women differently? How are they experiencing entrepreneurship in the US versus globally, and how has the pandemic impacted them differently as well?
There's a lot to unpack in that question. So I think from the pandemic perspective, we did not have any of our women-owned business go bankrupt. We did not have any of that or close their doors. Some needed more help than others. Australia did a particularly strong job because they kept childcare centers open, right? So often women, we didn't talk about elder care, but that's definitely an issue. Kids, sometimes your spouse needs medical, you know, support or care. But it really was dependent on what those countries were doing to support their businesses and their societies. I think if we've seen anything that has changed, we talked about flexibility, I think, on the last panel. We're trying to infuse more of that in our programs, and we really, as we see people setting up these new businesses, they're coming at it assuming flexibility, right? They're not thinking about a business that's 9 to 5 in an office all the time, but what the pandemic has shown us and them is the more flexible, the more agile you are, the more likely you are to be successful.
Great points. Thank you. Maria Luisa, you also work in a number of countries, the Women Exporter Program, but through the foundation there are a number of other programs supporting women around the world. How have you seen the pandemic impact women differently, and have you seen particular challenges that, you know, are still lingering where you're trying to support women in this space?
I think it's so interesting. I'm going to add another element to the question, and it is in the countries where you have more informality versus countries where you have more formality, because I think that is a huge impact. So for us, what we saw during the pandemic, first of all, I want to say I'm amazed about the resilience of women. That is just everyone, it's just the resiliency is amazing. The resiliency and the innovation. So we saw a lot of women in our program that actually had to go back home, right, and take care in restaurant. Their food is a huge business with women globally. And so what we saw is women started to do more training. And in some countries, we had to make the case, why should they consider become formal, a formal business versus an informal business? And it's an interesting dynamic, because to those that were in the formal economy, it was easier for governments to give them aid and help during the pandemic. Those that were in the informal economy, it was harder for the governments to get through to them. So that's one thing that I think we learned from that perspective, and making the case of, yes, you should become a formal economy and start paying taxes. And yes, and that was a tough one to sell. I'm not gonna lie. I pay taxes. I don't. But it was, I think, in some regions that was a challenge. I think the other part that we saw, which was very interesting, because in our case we also saw a lot of countries where women entrepreneurs grew during the pandemic because they were working from home, taking care of the family, of the elders, and you know what, I need to start making money, so they went online. And so I think that was the other part that we saw globally. In Colombia, for example, before the pandemic, 46% of SMBs were led by women. After the pandemic, it's up to 52%. So that's a big change. In the US, fascinating, because we also have our program here, in the US more, and we saw it in other countries, but here, more interest in getting training. So what are the skills that I need now to pivot and be agile and be able to launch? So those are the other things that we saw. I think that was the question, right? Did I cover?
Yeah.
No. But
Yeah,
it is
good to get a global perspective.
Yeah, it is fascinating. For governments too, it became a necessity to understand how to reach out. The majority of women entrepreneurs globally are small or micro, small, medium-sized enterprises. Policy-wise, it became a big deal. What are the policies that we need to change because we're not getting to the small businesses?
Absolutely. And the definition varies too, right? Who's a small business in different countries and who's a woman-owned business. So I think kind of getting data and definition around these is also so important. And Nina, you talked about some of your programming, and we were having a conversation earlier about impact, and I know that this room here is really interested in sort of the conversation on how do you measure impact as well. So if you could talk a little bit about what you're doing to measure the impact of your work.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. I think for any organization working in areas with entrepreneurs, data is critical. And one thing that we have found in particularly working with women, Black-owned food businesses is that there isn't a lot of data. So our work is actually trying to build upon that data. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of general data about Black women-owned businesses and entrepreneurs. There's a lot of just broad data about the area or investors or things like that. But when it comes to the food industry in particular, that is a huge gap. And I think that is it ends up being a disservice to organizations like us and other organizations like the ones up here that seek to support women-owned businesses, particularly looking at niche sectors like the food businesses, because this is where we get our information on the challenges, the opportunities. And oftentimes we're taking data from existing broader data and then checking it against the women that we have. I think that this is not enough. I mean, we don't work with every woman around the world in the food industry. And so what I think larger businesses could do is to invest in finding and supporting, getting data at the niche level so that we can actually critically hone in on the lenses of what Black women are facing around the world in the food industry. And as we add on to that data, as we build onto that data, we're only going to be able to see what the changes are, what the opportunities are, and where we can all invest our time, efforts, and respond to the needs adequately.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I know that others might want to chime in on this question of impact. Luisa?
Yeah, I agree with you. Data is very important. I think I'm going to add a layer to the data and culture too in different countries, where you were talking about how do you define a women-owned business, right? So in the US, we are in an amazing country where we can actually say 51% and higher, that's a women-owned business. In other countries, we can't do that because in some countries, women are not allowed to own a business. Let's start with that, right? Or open a checking account. I mean, imagine that you cannot open a checking account or have your own business. And so the data that we do is also either is it owned or led by women? And that's something that is very important for us because that data collection helps us make a difference, right? The second thing too that is important for us from a data perspective is what is the impact that you're having with the investments that you do? And we actually keep track of the women entrepreneurs after they go through the training, right? A year or 2 years. How many jobs were generated? How many families were changed? How much investment was made? That is the data that we keep track. And so I get excited when I see that after a training we generated 90 new jobs in that country. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's huge in the micro world of businesses. And so that's how we keep data is job generation, investment, and yes, we also measure the people that start to export more. That is huge because it's our Women Exporter program is we want them to be part of international trade. So that is important. One last thing, and I think you made a good point earlier, Shamarukh, is that a micro business in the US is probably considered a small or medium-sized business in other countries. And so you have to make certain that you cannot have a cookie-cutter approach when you look at the numbers. And that makes a big difference also in the investment, the type of training, and the policy recommendations that you give.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for making that clarification. And you mentioned kind of tracking these businesses, and I know that UI has these amazing programs to connect women. You have a number of network-focused programs. Do you also track sort of how they're benefiting from some of the networking as well?
And it's one of those hard things because sometimes we talked about the maybe less traditional economies, right? And so those who maybe aren't registered as businesses that are still in a place where they are supporting their families or supporting their communities. And the truth of it is, the hard truth of it is that data allows advocacy. There it is. So if I don't have your information, I don't have the data, I cannot advocate for you. I cannot advocate for you. And for us, when we track these programs, what it allows is us to do a better job of mentoring these companies. So that's a piece of it. It allows us to figure out what are the most powerful things we're doing. Is it training? Is it helping with a business plan? Is it helping navigate local, legal structures within which they need to operate? So we need the data for that. But it also helps us figure out where is the need in the community. Right? And so we might need to have more people who are working in a particular region or on a particular topic, let's say a product company, and fewer of our mentors and our business people working in this sector because maybe there isn't the need there. So data equals advocacy, and it stinks. I know it's hardcore, but otherwise we cannot make the case. We just can't make the case.
Yeah, the message is clear. I think the case for sex disaggregated data everywhere, and I know that with governments too, they're still coming up to speed in terms. Their statistics offices are coming up to speed on tracking the right sort of data as well. And speaking of governments, I know that this program too is co-sponsored by the Department of State. So a key theme has been what can government and business do together. So if you could each talk a little bit about where there are complementarities in some of the programming that you're doing, and where do you seek the most government support in supporting women's entrepreneurship? Anyone?
I'll go first. I love the partnership with governments. I think I'm going to start. The U.S. has amazing programs around the globe. We are partners of the Academy for Women Entrepreneurship. And that is an awesome program that I love because, and I went to the first, before we became, this is short story, fast, because I know we're running out of time. I went to the graduation in Chile. We were in Chile. We went to a graduation of some of the women entrepreneurs. I just left crying because it was this mom who worked, studied at night, did the training, and her husband, her mom, her whole family was there supporting her because it was the first formal training that she had received. And so partnering with the government, I'm highlighting this program, it makes a big difference because then you have the power of the US Embassy and USAID to help you in the countries. And yes, I know that might not sound really attractive, but it does make a difference in the countries where you are. And it brings the knowledge of government regulations, and that's very important.
I would just piggyback off that and talk about more private sector partnerships. I think it's been central for public-private sector partnerships to exist for the food industry. And for us, we've worked a lot with the private sector in creating opportunities for these businesses, large businesses, to really see how they can leverage the work of Black women-owned food businesses, but to reinvest their money back into them. Because if one of our partners right now is Uber Eats, and they see that it's really critical for these Black women-owned restaurants to thrive so that they can also be part of their platform and really be entrenched in a working ecosystem. If the food system is not working, these businesses are not thriving themselves. And so I think these private partnerships are also critical to supporting the government's initiatives that you mentioned.
So 100% on partnering with US government organizations and also local government organizations, right? That's where you're going to get the policy advocacy. So if there are legislative changes that need to happen to empower some of these women-owned businesses, if you are partnering with that, let's just say Morocco, because we started with that with the Assistant Secretary, if the Moroccan government and the US government can talk it out and get to a policy space that empowers more women-owned businesses, we really want to leverage that, right? Because any one of us on our own is not going to have that gravitas to make change happen. And I would also say there are any number of programs, particularly USAID, and then Millennium Challenge Corporation, state has some that empower women, whether it's literacy, we haven't talked about that a lot, but literacy and some of these other fundamental skill sets that we want to make sure they have. Some of those programs start where private sector stops, right? So that partnership is really important so that you have that seamless support structure.
Absolutely. So I know we're out of time, but just wanted to give you one last opportunity to choose a word or a phrase that you would focus on if we looked at the next 5 years in terms of what's most important. I know that some themes came up in the conversation, but anyone want to take a step?
Nina, go first.
One word to me is linkages. Just a small bit about it, like linkages within a system for Black women-owned businesses, food businesses.
I would say networking. We have learned different ways to use technology and communications to getting back to your question about the pandemic. Let's use those. Let's focus on those. Don't let those go because people may not have access to the internet always, right? Or things like that. Let's be creative in the way we empower these businesses.
Wonderful, thank you. Luisa?
I have so many words in my mind. No, I'm going to say enable. Enable those around you, enable your colleagues, enable organizations, and enable governments to continue to invest and believe in women entrepreneurship because it makes a difference in the community and it makes a difference in families. I mean, it is the whole community that benefit, not just women. It does make a difference. So enabling is important and don't lead with fear. I couldn't keep it, right? Lead with kindness and lead with believing that you can make a difference.
Perfectly said, all of you. So I know we're out of time, but let's thank everyone on the panel for this amazing insights.
Thank you.
We're exiting the other way.
The other way, okay.